The forging of an American ace. To fully comprehend the sheer, unadulterated audacity required for a single American fighter pilot to willingly dive into a formation of 9 highly maneuverable Imperial Japanese Navy Zeros, one must first understand the unique psychological and environmental crucible that forged Major Richard Ira Bong. The title of America's Ace of Aces, culminating in an unprecedented and still unbeaten record of 40 confirmed aerial victories, was not achieved through reckless bravado, but rather through a cold, mathematically precise application of aerial gunnery, combined with an almost preternatural understanding of the complex, twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Richard Bong was not a product of elite, aristocratic military academies. He was a soft-spoken, remarkably unassuming farm boy hailing from the rural, hard-working community of Poplar, Wisconsin. Growing up surrounded by the vast, open skies of the American Midwest, Bong developed an early, obsessive fascination with aviation, a passion that was abruptly crystallized by the geopolitical shockwaves of the early 1940s. When the United States was violently thrust into the Second World War following the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Bong transitioned from a civilian aviation enthusiast into the massive, rapidly expanding training pipeline of the United States Army Air Forces. During his flight training in Northern California, Bong demonstrated an unparalleled, almost terrifying proficiency in aerial gunnery. While other novice pilots struggled to calculate the complex trigonometry of deflection shooting, the art of aiming ahead of a moving target so that the bullets and the enemy aircraft intersect at the exact same point in space and time, Bong treated his fighter aircraft as an extension of his own body. His instructors noted that he possessed a hunter's instinct, a cold, detached focus that allowed him to put bullets precisely where he wanted them, regardless of the violent, high-G maneuvers required to achieve the firing solution. This innate marksmanship would become the absolute, foundational cornerstone of his entire combat career, compensating for what some of his peers considered as somewhat average capability in the realm of complex, acrobatic dogfighting maneuvers. Bong did not want to dance with the enemy in the sky. He wanted to eliminate them with a single, brutally efficient burst of concentrated firepower. The mount, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The instrument of Bong's legendary lethality was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a massive, highly unorthodox twin-engine fighter that perfectly complemented his specific tactical philosophy. In the brutal, unforgiving environment of the Southwest Pacific Theater, characterized by thousands of miles of empty ocean and dense, deeply hostile jungle canopies, the standard single-engine fighters of the era, such as the Bell P-39 Airacobra or the early models of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, were often viewed as flying coffins. If a single-engine fighter suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure or took a lucky hit from Japanese anti-aircraft fire over the vast expanses of the Bismarck Sea or the Owen Stanley Mountain Range, the pilot was almost certainly doomed. The P-38, however, possessed 2 massive, liquid-cooled Allison V1710 engines. This twin-engine redundancy provided American pilots with an unparalleled psychological safety net. If one engine was shattered in combat, the pilot could feather the propeller and nurse the crippled, heavy aircraft hundreds of miles back to a primitive, mud-soaked Allied airstrip. Furthermore, the P-38's unique twin-boom architecture allowed for a concentration of firepower that was absolutely devastating. Because the nose of the central nacelle was completely devoid of an engine block or a spinning propeller arc, the Lockheed engineers packed it with 4.50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns and a single, explosive 20mm Hispano cannon. In standard fighters with wing-mounted guns, the bullets converged at a specific distance and then splayed outward. In the P-38, the weapons fired straight ahead in a tight, parallel stream. For a master marksman like Richard Bong, this centralized firepower was the ultimate weapon. If he could get a Japanese aircraft into his reflector gun sight, he did not need to calculate convergence. He simply unleashed an aerial buzzsaw that instantly shredded the fragile, unarmored duralumin skin of the Imperial Japanese aircraft. Bong fundamentally understood that the Lightning was a heavy, industrial machine of war. It could not turn with the incredibly agile Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft practically designed to outmaneuver any opponent in a horizontal, twisting dogfight. Therefore, Bong utilized the P-38's massive speed, its unparalleled high-altitude climb rate, and its extreme weight to dictate the absolute terms of the engagement. He became the undisputed master of the boom and zoom tactic. The crucible of the Southwest Pacific. The theater in which Bong operated was arguably the most miserable, disease-ridden, and logistically starved combat zone of the entire Second World War. The 5th Air Force, commanded by the aggressive, highly innovative General George Kenney, operated out of primitive, sweltering airfields carved directly out of the dense jungles of New Guinea. The American aviators fought a daily battle not just against the highly experienced, fanatical veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, but against rampant malaria, debilitating dysentery, rotting food, and the relentless, suffocating tropical heat. The living conditions were utterly atrocious, and the operational tempo was grueling. It was in this unforgiving crucible that Richard Bong, assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, began to systematically dismantle the Japanese aerial supremacy over the Pacific. Bong's combat record was not built on singular, massive fleet engagements like the Battle of Midway, but rather on a relentless, daily grind of bomber escorts, fighter sweeps, and combat air patrols over hostile strongholds like Rabaul, Wewak, and Leh. He quickly earned a reputation among his peers for an almost unnerving lack of fear. While other pilots understandably felt the crushing weight of anxiety before a combat mission, Bong approached aerial combat with the same quiet, methodical demeanor he would use to repair a tractor on his father's farm in Wisconsin. He possessed ice in his veins. This absolute psychological control allowed him to maintain perfect situational awareness in the terrifying, multi-dimensional chaos of a massive aerial furball, where the sky was filled with spinning aircraft, blinding sun glare, tracing ammunition, and burning wreckage. The encounter: superior numbers and absolute aggression. The specific incident that perfectly encapsulates Bong's fearless, highly aggressive tactical mindset, wading into vastly superior enemy numbers, specifically taking on formations of up to 9 Japanese Zeros, occurred during the brutal, protracted campaign to isolate and destroy the Japanese strongholds along the northern coast of New Guinea. During a typical fighter sweep over the Markham Valley, a critical geographic corridor that the Japanese heavily utilized to funnel aircraft and supplies, Bong and his flight encountered a massive, highly organized formation of Japanese fighters. The Imperial Japanese Navy's A6M0 and the Imperial Japanese Army's Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar were terrifying opponents in the hands of experienced pilots. They were incredibly light, completely sacrificing pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve a turning radius and an acrobatic agility that American aircraft could not hope to match. The standard American tactical doctrine dictated that if a P-38 flight encountered superior numbers of highly maneuverable Japanese fighters, they were to maintain their altitude advantage, execute a single, high-speed firing pass, and immediately use their kinetic energy to escape. They were strictly ordered never to remain in the target area and engage in a turning fight. However, Richard Bong, utilizing his complete mastery of the Lightning's energy state, frequently bent these tactical rules to their absolute breaking point. Spotting the massive formation of Japanese fighters, Bong did not hesitate or call for a retreat. He recognized that the enemy formation, while numerically superior, was flying in a predictable, cruising pattern, entirely unaware of the American interceptors positioned high in the stratosphere above them. Pushing the throttles of his massive Allison engines forward, Bong initiated a screaming, high-speed vertical dive. Plunging out of the blinding tropical sun at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, the massive, twin-boom silhouette of the P-38 became an unavoidable messenger of destruction. Bong targeted the trailing elements of the Japanese formation. At these extreme speeds, the aerodynamic control surfaces of the P-38 became incredibly stiff, requiring immense physical strength to maneuver. Yet, Bong's gunnery was flawless. As he closed the distance in a matter of seconds, he squeezed the firing trigger on his control yoke. The centralized cluster of 50 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon roared, violently shaking the heavy fighter. A concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition slammed directly into the wing root of the trailing Japanese Zero. Because the Japanese aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, the result was an instantaneous, catastrophic explosion. The Zero erupted into a massive ball of orange flame and black smoke, completely disintegrating in midair. The element of surprise was shattered. The remaining 8 Japanese fighters immediately broke formation, their highly trained pilots instinctively pulling their nimble aircraft into tight, evasive turns, desperately searching for the unseen attacker. At this precise moment, conventional wisdom dictated that Bong should pull back on the yoke, climb into the safety of the upper atmosphere, and return to base. Instead, utilizing the immense kinetic energy retained from his dive, Bong violently pulled his heavy P-38 into a climbing turn, looping over the top of the chaotic, scattering Japanese formation. He was now operating in a highly dangerous, fluid environment surrounded by highly maneuverable enemy aircraft actively seeking to kill him. The Japanese Zeros, recognizing the lone American fighter in their midst, immediately attempted to swarm him. They tried to use their superior turning radius to angle their aircraft behind the P-38, attempting to secure a lethal firing solution on Bong's vulnerable tail booms. However, Bong flawlessly executed vertical maneuvers, trading his massive speed for altitude, hanging on the propellers, and forcing the lighter Japanese aircraft to stall out as they attempted to follow him up into the thin air. As a Zero stalled, hanging motionless in the sky for a fraction of a second, Bong would violently kick the rudder, bringing the nose of his heavy fighter down, and fire a precisely aimed, short burst. Another Zero exploded, trailing a massive plume of glycol and aviation fuel into the jungle below. The sheer violence, speed, and absolute aggression of Bong's attack completely paralyzed the tactical coordination of the Japanese pilots. They were facing an adversary who simply refused to fight by the established rules of engagement. Bong darted through the formation, never flying in a straight line for more than a few seconds, constantly altering his airspeed, his altitude, and his vector. He utilized the P-38's combat flaps to momentarily decrease his turning radius, scoring hits on a third Japanese fighter that attempted to cross his flight path. The engagement was a masterclass in energy fighting, proving definitively that a heavy, seemingly cumbersome American interceptor, when flown by a pilot possessing absolute situational awareness and unparalleled marksmanship, could completely dominate a vastly numerically superior force of highly agile enemy fighters. By the time Bong finally depleted his ammunition and utilized his remaining speed to dive away toward the safety of the Allied lines, the sky behind him was littered with the burning wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Air Forces. The toll of combat and the Medal of Honor. As Richard Bong's incredible tally of confirmed aerial victories climbed steadily higher, surpassing the legendary World War I record of 26 kills set by Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, the Army Air Force's leadership recognized that they possessed a living, breathing propaganda asset of immense national value. The United States military apparatus was desperate for genuine heroes to boost the morale of the American public and the millions of servicemen fighting across the globe. Bong, however, despised the spotlight. He was intensely uncomfortable with the press conferences, the mandatory war bond tours, and the constant attention from high-ranking generals. He viewed himself simply as a soldier doing a highly specialized, highly dangerous job. He frequently downplayed his own immense skill, attributing his incredible success to the ruggedness of his beloved P-38 Lightning, the dedication of his overworked ground crews, and simple, sheer luck. Despite his profound humility, the military leadership could not ignore his unprecedented achievements. General George Kenney frequently grounded Bong, terrified that his premier ace would eventually succumb to the sheer mathematical probability of death that haunted every combat pilot in the Pacific. Kenney ordered Bong back to the United States to serve as a gunnery instructor, hoping to pass on his lethal knowledge to the next generation of American aviators. However, the pull of the combat zone was irresistible for Bong. He repeatedly lobbied, pleaded, and negotiated his way back to the front lines in New Guinea and the Philippines, operating under the highly unusual, technically non-combat status of a gunnery instructor, who was somehow permitted to fly highly dangerous, deep-penetration fighter sweeps over heavily defended Japanese territory. It was during these later stages of the Pacific Campaign, specifically the massive, incredibly violent American invasion of the Philippine Islands, that Bong's absolute dedication to his duty was recognized at the highest possible level. On December 12, 1944, on a muddy, rain-swept airfield in Tacloban, Leyte, General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, personally draped the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest award for valor, around the neck of Major Richard Bong. The citation explicitly detailed his absolute fearlessness, noting that he voluntarily and repeatedly sought out aerial combat against vastly superior numbers of enemy aircraft, exposing himself to extreme danger to protect his fellow pilots and further the Allied advance. MacArthur, a man not known for offering casual praise, looked at the young farm boy from Wisconsin and stated that he represented the absolute highest traditions of the American military spirit. Following the award of the Medal of Honor, and having reached the staggering, unbelievable milestone of 40 confirmed aerial victories, a record that remains entirely untouched in the history of American military aviation, General Kenney permanently grounded Bong and ordered him back to the United States for good. The military simply could not risk the devastating psychological blow to the nation that would result from the death of its greatest living hero in the final, desperate months of the war. The tragic irony of August 6, 1945. Richard Bong returned to the United States a national icon. He married his sweetheart, Marge Vattendahl, whose photograph he had famously plastered across the nose of his P-38 Lightning, creating one of the most iconic pieces of nose art of the entire war. Seeking to continue his contribution to the advancement of American aviation, Bong was assigned as a highly specialized test pilot for the Lockheed Corporation in Burbank, California. He was tasked with evaluating and pushing the limits of the absolute bleeding edge of aeronautical technology, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the United States Army Air Force's very first operational jet-powered fighter. The transition from the massive, piston-engine P-38 Lightning to the sleek, incredibly fast, but highly temperamental jet aircraft was perilous. Early jet engines were notoriously unreliable, prone to catastrophic flameouts, massive fuel leaks, and sudden, violent losses of thrust. On the afternoon of August 6, 1945, Bong climbed into the cockpit of a P-80 for a routine acceptance flight. Shortly after taking off from the Lockheed Air Terminal, the aircraft's primary fuel pump suffered a catastrophic failure. The jet engine instantly starved of fuel and flamed out while the aircraft was merely hundreds of feet above the ground, in a highly vulnerable, low-speed, nose-high attitude. Bong, utilizing the same lightning-fast reflexes that had saved his life in dozens of brutal aerial dogfights over the Pacific, immediately attempted to clear the aircraft and bail out. He pulled the canopy release and unbuckled his harness. However, the extreme low altitude and the violent, asymmetrical aerodynamic forces acting upon the stalling jet fighter sealed his fate. He was unable to successfully deploy his parachute before the aircraft plunged heavily into the ground, exploding in a massive fireball. The greatest fighter pilot in the history of the United States, a man who had survived hundreds of hours of the most intense, violent, and dangerous aerial combat ever recorded, was killed in a tragic, mechanical accident over the safe, suburban streets of California. The news of Richard Bong's death was a profound, devastating shock to the American public and the military establishment. However, the tragedy of his passing was almost entirely overshadowed by the monumental, world-altering event that occurred on that exact same day. On August 6, 1945, thousands of miles away across the Pacific Ocean, an American Boeing B-29 Superfortress named the Enola Gay dropped the first operational atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly obliterating the city and entirely changing the course of human history. The massive, glaring headlines announcing the dawn of the nuclear age relegated the tragic death of America's ace of aces to the secondary columns of the nation's newspapers. The legacy of Richard Ira Bong is not merely a mathematical tally of destroyed enemy aircraft. His story is the absolute, definitive embodiment of the American war effort during the Second World War. He represented the seamless, incredibly lethal fusion of unparalleled American industrial engineering, manifested in the massive, highly complex Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and the quiet, unassuming, yet utterly unyielding determination of the American citizen soldier. When he waded into a formation of 9 highly maneuverable Imperial Japanese Zeros over the miserable, disease-ridden jungles of New Guinea, he did not rely on bravado or arrogant boasting. He relied on cold, calculated marksmanship, absolute mastery of his machinery, and an unwavering, internalized dedication to the total destruction of the enemy forces arrayed against him. The 40 Imperial Japanese aircraft that fell before his guns serve as a permanent, undeniable testament to the incredible lethality of the farm boy from Wisconsin, ensuring that his name remains eternally enshrined at the absolute, untouchable zenith of the pantheon of American military aviation.